Hi, everyone. Chris Richardson here, immigration attorney, former visa officer, and general counsel COO of B2B Solutions. One question that's been rocking the immigration world is this issue of visa retrogression. A lot of people want to know, is it a blip? Is it something that's permanent? Will the wait times and backlogs grow longer? When will we be current again, especially with EB-3 unskilled? What's causing it? No one has a crystal ball, but we all have theories on what's going on. And I have my own theory on it. But first, though, we need to look at some basic facts about what is visa retrogression. Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1990. The act created the various employment-based immigration categories. And so there's EB-1, EB-2, EB-3, EB-4, and EB-5. But Congress only allocates 140,000 of those green cards per year for the employment-based categories, and that's it. Within each category, you have about 40,000, and that's all for each year. And if USCIS or the government doesn't use those numbers for employment-based side, at least they do not roll over. So it really is use it or lose it. Within the EB-3 category, which is what we work in, up to 10,000 of those can be used for unskilled versus skilled. That 140,000 number isn't always true, by the way. So Congress also allows for family-based numbers to spill into the number of green cards available. And so the actual employment-based numbers, due to COVID and everything that happened with the embassies being shut down and USCIS being shut down, people couldn't issue family-based cases. And so those numbers actually spilled into employment-based. And so the real number of employment-based cases actually doubled in the last couple of years. But as COVID recedes and you see more family-based cases being issued, we're seeing that 140,000 is the norm once again. And so what we're seeing is that there's been a tightening of the employment-based cases, but that's a story for another day. Let's get into what is visa retrogression. There's some terms that people just have to understand, and one of them being this idea of a visa bulletin. A visa bulletin is issued every month by the Department of State. It shows which green card applications can be filed and which applications can move forward to green card issuance based on when the labor certification was filed. Why does the visa bulletin exist? There's a numerical cap, like we said, on the number of green cards that can be issued each year. And this number is further divided by the different categories and what's known as the country caps. And so each country only is allowed to have 7% of the 140,000. Within, like I said, within EB-3, there's only 10,000 that's allowed for EB-3 unskilled jobs, is what we work in. Because there's a higher demand than supply available, boom, you get a backlog. The priority date is the date on which your labor certification was filed. Think of the priority date as the foreign national's place in line because it determines when the green card application can be filed and when it can be issued. And so what is retrogression? Usually the visa bulletin cutoff dates move forward in time, right? And so what that means is that, when you get green card applications, as USCIS starts issuing them and consular affairs starts issuing them, we should get closer and closer to that date. When there are more applications for a green card category than the government was expecting, though, the cutoff dates may move backwards. And so retrogression is the cutoff date in the visa bulletin moving backwards due to an increase in demand. And so when you see like a huge increase in demand, you see that the dates just go further and further and further and further back. So right now with EB-3 unskilled, we're seeing a date in 2020, basically. And so I think for a lot of people, they're concerned about, well, why is this and what's going on and what are we going to do to fix it, or what can be done to fix it, if anything at all. And so what's causing visa retrogression? There's a lot of theories on that. And I think that the other categories are also seeing some retrogression as well. But for the EB-3 unskilled category, the likely causes of retrogression are multiple factors. You have the COVID-19 delays at the consulates and embassies abroad. You have a surge of thousands of older EB-3 unskilled cases, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, being reaffirmed by USCIS. You're seeing thousands of people who were EB-2 and EB-1 cases that are being downgraded to EB-3 unskilled. And there's the growing popularity of the EB-3 unskilled programs as well. But I think, though, that the primary issue is that, so take a step back in 2015, 2016, there were thousands of EB-3 unskilled cases that were basically being sent to embassies and consulates abroad. And what was happening is that the embassies and consulates really just didn't like the agents. They really distrusted a lot of the people that were involved in the EB-3 unskilled realm. And so what Consular decided to do was basically put a stop blockage on the issuances of all EB-3 unskilled. They put them all in admin processing, especially in China and Korea. You really didn't see much of any EB-3 unskilled being issued at all. And so they were all sent back to USCIS for revocation. USCIS basically sat on these cases, thousands of them, investigated them, looked into them. And then recently, in the last couple of years, they decided to actually send them all back to consular affairs for issuances. And so it's important to understand consular can't actually revoke a visa on its own, not an employment-based visa on its own. It actually has to send it back to USCIS with the recommendation that it be revoked. And so consular sent thousands of these cases back to USCIS, said, hey, we think you should revoke all of these bad actors and bad agents in the employment-based unskilled category. And so we're going to shut this program down, or not shut it down, but we're certainly going to scrutinize it, right? So USCIS looks into it, they analyze it, they think about it, and they say, nah. So they sent all of these cases, thousands of these cases back to the State Department, right? But the State Department, though, because of COVID-19, really hasn't been able to reopen. And so the people that decide the visa bulletin, what they're doing is they're looking at all these numbers and they're saying, wow, that is a lot of cases that we're going to now have to issue. What can we do to get those issued? How can we do that? And so what they're doing is saying, you know what, let's prioritize these old cases that were supposed to have been issued back in 2015 and 2016 and 2017. Let's give priority to those cases now that, you know, USCIS has sent them all back to consular. Consular, though, because they are so busy and overwhelmed due to COVID and their own backlog to the other categories, really doesn't have the bandwidth to deal with it, right? So my theory is that consular is basically saying, well, hey, we don't really have the bandwidth to deal with this. And the people in the visa bulletin says, you know what, let's prioritize those old cases then. Let's focus on those old cases. And that's what the cause of visa retrogression probably is. You're really seeing a combination of different things, but you're really seeing a lot of these old cases. You're seeing a lot of people who are downgraded. And, you know, the thing about it is there are a lot of people who filed multiple I-140s who wanted to basically test the waters on both EB-3 unskilled, EB-3 skilled. And so you're seeing this combination of things, but consular hasn't been able to issue these visas fast enough in the year. And so, boom, that's what we're seeing is visa retrogression. And so then the question becomes, well, what can be done? And I think, though, that what's going to happen is that a lot of this visa retrogression stuff is basically a blip in time, right? I think that once consular starts issuing visas and once we get through this hump, I would call it almost like a pig in a python. Once we get through this hump of old cases from 2015, 2016, 2017, and those cases have all been issued and that backlog of old cases is cleared out, we'll start seeing things get current or almost current again. I really think that in October, we're going to see some real movement, but it really just depends on how fast consular is going to move on a lot of this stuff. In the meantime, for BDV's sake, we're going to be pushing on something called visa recapture. So, like I said earlier, of that 140,000, what is it used is basically lost. And so you've seen a lot of employment-based cases since 1990 that weren't used at all, that were just lost to time. And so some members of Congress are pushing to recapture or reuse pull all those old numbers that got lost and put them back in the pot. That would be a huge win, and that would ensure that we wouldn't really see visa retrogression because you would see a huge number of cases that would be available. Another thing that you can do is exempt dependents, because right now, dependents, meaning spouses and children, they all count toward the cap. And so of that 140,000, how many are actually working? Probably only about 40, maybe 50% of them. The rest of them are actually dependents of the actual workers. And so if the White House or Congress were to push for an exemption, you could see some real movement on visa retrogression. But even if you don't see those things, I anticipate that once consular gets its systems up and running and moving, we're going to see real headway and see a real decline in the number or moving further, hopefully forward with the visa backlog, with visa retrogression. And so I hear all the time from people who are like, oh man, visa retrogression, that means the end of EB-3 unskilled. And look, since 1990, you've seen periods, waves of visa retrogression. You've seen periods of it being current. You've seen it happen, and then you've seen State Department invest and try to issue as many visas as possible. And so I tell people, don't be discouraged, right? Because we've been through this period before. We've seen these things before. My theory is that because we've seen like these tens of thousands of old cases that are now been thrown in Consular's lap, Consular just needs time to work through them all. But Consular is going to get through them all. Consular is already starting to open up its systems already. And so once we get through that, we're really going to see headway, and we're really going to see movement on the visa retrogression. And so I tell people, don't lose hope, don't lose faith. We're going to see the end of this. Chris Richardson signing off. Thanks, everybody.